I feel like if I had tried doing this as little as maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I don't think I could have made my deadlines because I think the experience that I've had in figuring out my media, the technology, and my process was my whole lifetime of experience figuring out how to get to this point that I could produce this quickly.
Welcome to You May Contribute a Verse. I'm Brenna Jennerette, children's book author of the upcoming nonfiction picture book, A Bike is Not Just a Bike, about how the bicycle helped to usher in the women's revolution, illustrated by Michelle Piaria, launching July 21st, 2026, and now available for pre-order. And I'm joined by my co-host Josh Munkin, dad, kidlit author, and science communicator. This episode is proudly sponsored by Canadian children's book publisher Tealmore Press, where every book sold supports reforestation. Check out Tealmore's newest release, Enough to Share, written by Mary Helen Berg, and illustrated by Sue Todd. It's a warmly illustrated book about our beautiful and fragile planet with themes of sharing and the importance of coexistence. Check out this title and the full Tealmore catalog at tealmorepress.com, including titles like Naked, Fungi Are More Than Mushrooms, and Supermoon. Today's guest is Stan Yan, author-illustrator of The Many Misfortunes of Eugenia Wang. We talk about his start in the comic world, stepping into the role of co-regional manager for SCBWI, how having a kid informed and continues to inform Stan's writing, and of course, how Many Misfortunes came to be. Here's Stan's verse.
Make it weird.
No promises.
Well, first of all, thanks for joining us. I'm so glad to actually sit down and chat with you because you and I have run into each other at several local events over the last year or so, but I haven't been able to have an actual conversation with you because you're very busy usually. You are always, sort of running a booth or chatting with somebody, or you're very plugged into the local community, which is very cool. But I'm glad to actually be able to chat with you.
Well, that's the unfortunate part of being co-regional advisor of SCBWI chapter.
Yeah, very, very busy, very popular. Well, why don't we start there? How did you end up in that position? And what have you, how is it going so far? Do you enjoy it? Do you like that position?
I actually have been the unwitting head of 2 other not-for-profit organizations, and I always promised myself I wouldn't do this to myself again. But unfortunately, we kind of ended up in a situation where we had a mass exodus of our regional team in this chapter, and so there was a vacuum. And at that point, I think all the things I learned about the children's book industry was really helped along by the volunteers in this chapter, the events, the conference, and I felt like it would be a real shame if this organization went away because no one stepped up. And I felt like I kind of owed it to this chapter to give back. And even though at that time nothing was official yet, I was about to sign with my new agent, and which quickly turned into a book deal. So I knew all of these things were coming, and I wanted to make sure that the really talented people in our chapter didn't have that opportunity taken away from them. That would have been a shame.
How long had you been involved? Because you said this was right about the time you got a new agent and a book deal, but how long had you been involved with the chapter, and what had it given you that made you want to give back to it?
I'd been involved since 2014, and in fact, I actually was involved before I was officially a member, because our previous illustrator coordinator and one of my besties and critique group partner, Kaz Winnes, which is how I found out about your podcast, because you interviewed her. Well,
hi Kaz.
She invited me to be a faculty member. So she invited me to be on the faculty of one of the Letters and Lines conferences. And right around that time also, I just started writing my first picture book, and she invited me to be a part of her brand spanking new SCBWI critique groups. I think that obligated me to actually join the SCBW. It took me about 6 months, and then I finally pulled the trigger.
Well, that's so funny. Josh is sort of in a similar boat with SCBWI, kind of sort of like watching it on the periphery and not quite sure if he wants to like get involved or not get involved.
It's
Yeah,
more, I mean, I've been a member. It's just like, I don't find I have an abundance of time to engage with it. And I really wish I did. Would love to be more purposeful about it. It's just, it's a matter of bandwidth, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
I like backdooring into things, though. I think that's a fun way to sort of circumvent natural processes.
So Stan, let's back up just a little bit. So you have
Okay.
like a comic background, right? Like that's where you started. So can you walk us through like how you got started in comics and then, when you sort of transitioned into graphic novel / picture books?
Yeah. I think it's all started, at least my earliest memories was when I was 4 years old. Like my
Oh
earliest
man,
memories
wow,
of
way
being able to
back.
hold a pencil was, yeah, drawing the same stick figure character over and over again, doing different things in these boxes that I found out later were called panel borders. So I was drawing comics before I knew that that's what I was doing. And my earliest influences were actually comic strips because I have a short attention span and I needed immediate gratification as a reader. But I think it was when I was in high school that was like the first time that I seriously considered doing long form comic stories. I took this class through a local school called Colorado Free University that was taught by a guy who kind of became my mentor, Tom Motley. And based on the description, I just assumed that it was about how to draw comic strips or how to maybe break in and sell a comic strip to the newspaper. And it actually ended up being comic books. So I was like, well, what do I do here? So I actually kind of retrofitted a short story that I'd written for my high school creative writing class and turned it into like a comic short story that ended up being my first published work. It got published in this anthology called Acme Number 10. But in the process of drawing that, I was like, wow, this is kind of liberating. I don't have to come up with a punchline every 3 to 4 panels. I can kind of stretch it out, play with the page turns. You're not, limited to a certain amount of real estate in the comic strip format. You can actually use the whole page, and that kind of opened my eyes to what comics could do for me as a storyteller.
How did you decide, or like when did you pivot then into, picture books and more graphic novel, like long form stuff?
Well, I think I was already getting into graphic novels. Like everything that I was doing early on was just to get like a single issue, 24-page comic done for the next year of the comic convention season. And then eventually I was compiling those together into a graphic novel. And I think really the thing that kind of changed things was having a kid, because I think once I had a kid and my whole inspirations shifted from things that didn't involve kids to I'm just immersed in kids entertainment and inspired by my son and his experiences and how he's growing up. Then, and looking at all of the publications that were available to him, I was like, I want to do this. And plus, I've always kind of had a bone to pick with serialized comics because it was never enough story for me. And I was irritated that I'd have to wait for a next issue that I would never end up buying or picking up, or I would end up buying a comic book that was like in issue 4, and it was just not enough story for me to be compelled to search out issues 1 through 3. So, I just
Unless
wanted
you
to,
wait for the anthology, right?
right. So I just wanted the collections. I just wanted the complete stories. And there were very few comics that I actually asked my local comic book store to put on my pull list. I didn't even know there was such a thing called a pull list. And so I didn't want to do that to people either. I just wanted to create stories that people could sit down and enjoy and were something that, wouldn't just last for 5 minutes, 10 minutes of reading.
Were you
Yeah.
You must have been a comic reader too. And I ask this as someone who I have never been a single issue comic book reader. My dad was and
Uh-huh.
collected single issue comic books for 50 years. And every Wednesday had a pull
Uh-huh.
list at his comic shop and spent just absurd amounts of money and time on his comics and his comic collection. I've
Wow.
done my best to disabuse my brother of that habit as well, but he seems to be immune. I've always been way more attracted to, like you said, the full story. You don't want to
Right.
have these little carrots dangled. If I want that, I go to TV.
Right, right, exactly. Because I have a short attention or a short memory as well, so I don't remember what happened to the last issue, you know. I've got I think the one of the only books that I collected was the whole series of The Walking Dead, and yeah, I couldn't tell you what was in earlier issues. I mean, you know, certain moments like when major characters died and things like that, but other than
Yeah.
that, you know, I feel like the whole formula of serialized comic books is a little bit abusive. I always kind of likened it to like a drug dealer that isn't expanding their market, but they're just like going back to the well and abusing the addicted people that are already their customers, you know?
Yeah, it's exploitative. I mean, in the same way that like anime and manga are. I mean, especially anime where there's just so much fluff and you're just stretching out the story to keep people's eyeballs engaged.
Right. Although I do respect like manga in the way that they can teach other creators what is absolutely necessary because so many of these stories were created in these manga magazines that are these collection of 20-page installments of the story, but they come out like weekly. So the production schedule is insane. And so if you kind of look at it, you know, the artwork can still be really beautiful, but they're only drawing what they need to. So it's kind of good to dissect it in a way where you're saying, okay, see, they spent all this time on this one large establishing shot, and then after that, there's no backgrounds. There's maybe motion lines and things like that because you know they haven't changed settings, and so I think it's useful to understand that you know you don't have to spend the amount of time that you need to and make your life miserable because you're thinking that you need to have a detailed background in every panel. In fact,
It's
that whole
yeah.
Interesting.
approach can slow down the pacing of your story and make the reading experience more difficult for your reader.
It's
But that's
that's
the teaching
interesting.
side of me coming out, right?
Well, no, that's good. Bring more of that. That's interesting. I'd never really thought about it in that exact sense where it's kind of an exercise in minimalism, but also
Yeah.
time and energy.
Time
I mean, if
management
you think,
is huge in
yeah,
comics. Like when I was teaching at the college level, and I technically I am, but I've been sabbatical for 2 years. But that was like the main thing I was grading on was meeting your deadlines because if you want to make it in this industry, that is the most important part of it. And so I've had students that were amazing artists, but they just set up impossible expectations of themselves and got bad grades because they couldn't meet their deadlines.
Wow, interesting.
the children's book thing that immediately comes to mind is comparing and contrasting with Mo Willems. Just a super minimalist, character-driven thing with
Uh-huh.
like a recent favorite in our house, which is the Bakery Dragon, which came out this year. And I know Brenna, you and I both have really loved that book, but
Yeah.
it was written and illustrated by a concept artist who by definition puts just an amazing amount of effort into every single lushly illustrated
Right.
spread. Just not it's not possible with a level of churn required by the comics industry. It's a kind of a creative decision that you make
Yes.
as
Well,
an
I mean,
illustrator, right?
oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that especially in trade publishing, because the speed at which you have to finish your pages to meet your deadlines, there can't be a hesitation. You have to go into it with, I guess, a level of certainty about what your process is and what your style is going to be throughout this. Like my last book was 264 pages, and when I like pulled out the time that I had to wait for editorial notes back, I figured out that I had done my rough layouts, my pencils, my inks, the lettering, the colors, all in a single calendar year, which is as
Wow.
fast as I've ever worked on anything. But
for
I feel like
264 pages.
if I had tried doing this as little as maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I don't think I could have made my deadlines, because I think the experience that I've had in figuring out my media, the technology, and my process was my whole lifetime of experience figuring out how to get to this point that I could produce this quickly. And so I used to run like an...
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that's a perfect embodiment of no effort is wasted, right? Because everything that you're doing, whether it sees completion or not, is feeding the eventual end product of your ability to get out of your own head and produce this massive amount of work relatively quickly.
Yeah, for 10 years, I had been doing this, hosting this event locally. There's Scott McCloud started this 24-hour comic book day challenge, which is a challenge to write and illustrate a full 24-page comic book in 24 consecutive hours. And I either did it or ran it for 10 years, which I think was a really important part of my training. But by the last year, I was running it in 3 different locations simultaneously, where I had people running it at the different locations. And just to keep myself honest, like the people running the different locations, we would like trade story premises, so that we didn't know what we were going to draw until the clock, or we were going to write about until the clock struck 12. And then I would open the email from the other guy, and they're like, okay, what am I going to be writing about? What am I going to be drawing?
Wow.
But on top of that, I also would challenge myself to try new media. Like the first time I did a fully digital comic was at the 24-hour comic challenge. And that was actually the toughest one, because I only finished with a few minutes to spare. But then later on, I also did one fully in watercolor for the first time, and then was trying gouache the year after that. And those actually were, because you had to let the washes dry, it was like a longer process theoretically, but I finished a lot sooner. So I think like the last year I did it, we had a massage therapist giving out massages to people. So I took a half an hour for that. And then I finished 3 hours early, went to breakfast with some people. So I had gotten my, process down to a science by then. And I didn't feel like I was cutting any corners, because like there were some years where I was like, well, I didn't have enough panels per page, or I didn't have enough text on the page, or enough dialogue. And so every year I would try to do better and challenge myself more to, create a comic that was more like something that I'd feel is publishable. Although by virtue of the fact that I didn't know what I was going to write about, it took away a lot of the preciousness that you would normally have, and allowed me to kind of just push forward and think about, okay, I've got this much time left and this many pages left to go. How quickly do I need to produce this page,
Yeah. Wow.
There's a phrase that I think of, and I don't know if it's a maxim or a proverb or a whatever, and I don't know where it came from, but I try and remind myself regularly that work expands to fill the time allotted for it. And
yes.
If you are the sort of person, like I tend to be by default, who does not have deadlines, if when no one else is imposing deadlines on me, I have forever to finish my project, well, then it just doesn't get done. There's really something to be said for 24-hour comic book day, or as we've talked about on the podcast for in a lot of episodes, the value in something like 12 by 12. Just get it done, get out of your head and get it done, because you've got the tools in your brain to do it if you get out of your own way.
Right. And I think that's like the benefit to doing something like a writing retreat, even conference, because I think conference kind of gives you things to shoot for. Like, I got to get my portfolio done before the conference, or I need to finish the first 10 pages for my manuscript critique that I purchased.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah. That's why I feel like they're it's like, I've been to, a children's book conference before, but if you just say, I'm going to go every year, that also kind of gives you something to shoot for.
Yeah. Okay, so Stan, as you were talking, I was thinking about, like, you have this really impressive, like, long comic background. And then I was thinking about the first book that I know of that has been published from you, The Zombie in the Basement. Is that
Right.
so it's not a comic book, but it does have comic book elements. So can you
Right.
talk about, how that sort of came about? Like, where did that come from?
So my son was about 3 years old, and at that time I'd been doing a lot of comic book conventions where I was drawing zombie caricatures of people as a way
Amazing.
of making extra money when I wasn't selling a lot of books. Because by that time I was a stockbroker for about 13 years when I started going to comic book conventions.
Oh
And
my
so I
God.
didn't really have to think about making money at these conventions, more just building my fan base with my books.
Yeah.
But then I got laid off twice in 3 years, and I'm like, oh gosh, I'd been considering it. I'd been watching people make money, make a career out of doing comics. And so I'd learned quite a bit. And I was like, well, I need to start making money at these things if this is going to be a part of my career. And I'd seen a
I,
lot of my friends
yeah.
doing fan-based drawings, commissions. So I'm like, well, maybe I can do, fan-based caricatures of people. And I'd been thinking about this, but I had always been afraid of how people would react to how I drew them. And so I'm like, well, if I do zombie versions of them, then maybe, they'll expect to look awful. That'll be a lot of pressure off of me. And fortunately for me, that was
Smart.
right around the time zombies were getting really big. And so I started to become known for that. But at the same time, it was cannibalizing my book sales. And so I'm like, shoot, I need to like have a book that has something to do with zombies, because most of the people that are getting zombie characters from me don't read my books, or it got to the point where people were like, I don't read comics, but they're at a comic book convention, which was weird. And then that devolved into I don't read. I'm like, and you didn't even hesitate before you said that. So I'm like, well, maybe there's something that I can do to create something that has some cross promotional aspect to it. So, one of the things I did was I did a one-shot comic story for a publisher that was doing the Vincent Price Presents books, and they were looking for kind of Twilight Zone-esque story. So I wrote a story that was very meta, as a story about me doing zombie caricatures of people at a comic book convention, and these people that I'm drawing start dying off. And when I start to realize that, I start panicking because I've drawn one of myself on my business card. And so I'm just looking at, I'm going to die and all the dangers that are surrounding me. And then the next thing that I did was inspired by my son, who one day wouldn't come down to my basement studio for some reason. And his mom asked him what was wrong, because our laundry room's down there as well. And he said, I'm scared. And she's like, what are you scared of? And he started pointing at all of the zombie caricature artwork hanging from my walls. And in an hour, from that moment of inspiration, an hour later, I had my manuscript written for There's a Zombie in the Basement, which was really meant to be, all those imaginary things that go bump in the night. There's nothing to be afraid of. And so I was trying to create something that would, eventually soothe his fears. But in the moment, my immediate reaction was to ignore him and capitalize on this moment of inspiration. But as soon as I had a working dummy of the book kind of sketched out, I took it up to him, or I went upstairs to show my wife, and this was late at night, and there's no reason he should have still been awake. And he saw it in my hands. He's like, "Read it to me, Dad." And I was like, "Uh-oh." And
He
my
was
wife
17 at
wasn't.
this point, no longer scared about zombies. Yeah, yeah. Way, way
Right,
later.
no, this was a couple of years later, after I was actually in the SEBWI, and I had taken a intensive with Selena Yoon. She taught us how to make a book dummy that actually looked like a hardcover book. So I'd made one of these, and so to him it looked like a real book. So he wanted me to read it to him, and my wife already knew what it was, and she wasn't quite certain that it was going to work to alleviate his fears. If anything, I might have to stay up and console him because I made him more scared. But I read it to him, and after I was done, he just rolled over and went to sleep. I'm like, oh my gosh, it worked. It worked.
This is either really boring or it had the intended effect.
Yep.
Amazing.
And so there definitely was a lot to like the page to page sequential storytelling that I'd borrowed from, doing comics all of these years. But after that book, it became clear that I really needed much more expansive storytelling because I really like to develop worlds and develop character and have a lot more pages to kind of spread my wings. And 32 to 40 pages with a single major image per page or per spread just wasn't enough real estate for me. And then on top of that, you know, I mentally and from a maturity level am always a 13-year-old, and I need the ability to have some toilet humor moments. And so I'm like, well, middle grade really is where I need to be.
It's time for this week's book reviews. Josh's review for this week is nerdy in the best way, and well-timed to align with the launch of Artemis 2 last week. The stuff between the stars is at once two complicated stories. The stories of Vera Rubin's struggle for recognition in a very male-dominated field, and the struggle to understand the very fabric of the universe. Pun sort of intended, dark matter is a dense idea for even adults to grasp, but author Sandra Nickel and illustrator Aimee Sicuro do a great job of painting a swirly picture of how the math just doesn't math when it comes to the part of the universe we can literally see. It's an education and an inspiration. Now go watch some Artemis 2 videos. And my review for this week is for Sparkle Pigs, by a friend of the pod, Kit Holliday, also known as Steph Campisi. This adorable, sparkle-tastic, zany story is the first in the series, and you will want to read them all. Muffin and Ziggy are perfect opposites, setting the stage for hilarious interactions and humor galore. The story has them running through a castle, running into a magic bunny, and singing some guinea pig karaoke. Short chapters, fast adventure, and plenty of sparkles. Kit Holliday's Sparkle Pigs is the perfect book for any kid looking for a fun read. Don't forget to get your own reviews and library requests in. It's the #1 way to help an author's sales. And now, back to our show.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because, okay, so your book coming out, The Many Misfortunes of Eugenia, Wang, right? Are you primarily then sort of sticking to the middle grade lane at this point? And then also, tell us all about your book coming out.
At this moment, I feel like Eugenia Wang was a challenge for myself. So it wasn't actually the first middle grade graphic novel that I wrote, but I've always been, as you could probably imagine, because of the zombie character thing, I've always been kind of obsessed with the horror genre, from when I was a little kid. So, but comics never really did it for me, in spite of the fact that comics has a storied history in horror. Horror comic books just never really scared me the same way as novels, where my visual imagination does all the heavy lifting, or movies where you've got, the benefit of adding sound, and the editor paces it in the way that everyone's watching it at the same speed. So for me, I was like, my bucket list item is, before I die, I'm going to write and illustrate a comic that actually scares me. So that was really my only thing. It wasn't even meant to be a children's book, but one of the things that I sat down and thought about as I was trying to figure out how I would go about making a scary comic book was, what was it about the horror genre that consistently scared me? And as I started to think about it, it was always like scenes or stories where you were relating to a child's character, maybe a child that hasn't discounted the possibility of what could or couldn't be. They're an open book, and so I was like, okay, I'm going to make my protagonist a child. And so as I was writing this, it inadvertently became a children's book. And so that's kind of the root of what this ended up being.
I was going to ask about, because I know that you're on your second agent. Is this the book that landed this second agent for you? Or
actually,
did
it
that
wasn't.
happen a different way? Oh,
it wasn't.
So tell us.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us about your journey, I guess, to getting your agent, and go ahead and shout her name out too, just so we've got sort of an anchor there.
Is my amazing agent, and I actually didn't know about her until I did the I think it was like the very last Pit Mad Twitter pitch event before they closed that down.
Yeah.
And so I was pitching 3 different projects at that time through the Twitter pitch event, one of which was what ended up being The Many Misfortunes of Eugenia Wang. And then one of the other ones, which is the one that Anne liked, was based on, I don't know if you guys have seen my comic strip, Peter Cadaver.
No, I haven't. I'm gonna have to look at that. Peter Cadaver, amazing.
So yeah, there's a kind of a world that I've built around the school in it's supposed to be in Salem, Massachusetts, which was a school founded by witches, but in the spirit of diversity, they've let all of the monsters in. And my main characters are a brother and sister, like they're brother and sister zombies, and one of is Peter, and I started doing them as a comic strip as a way of trying to promote the project that I was querying or submitting. I think with my first agent, I was on sub with it, but after we parted ways and I started querying again, I went ahead and started querying with that project, and that was the one that Anne liked. And the funny thing, and the very unlikely pairing of us, was that at that time she had no illustrators and no graphic novelists as clients.
Interesting.
Yes. And then and also one of her pet peeves was stories that began
Zombies.
with protagonists waking up, and that was how my story started. So it was
Shoot, and
weird
you're
that
like, no.
so yeah, it was weird that she was interested in me and actually extended an offer to represent based on the story, knowing all of those things now.
What was the process by which she added you to her roster as what was becoming her first illustrator graphic novelist client? Because that's kind of it's a new sector.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and for me, like if you were just to look at everything on the surface, you'd be like, why the heck did you even go with her at all? You know?
That was going to be my question. Not like that, but like how did you vet her if
What
she
were you
didn't have
thinking?
any
Right.
previous experience?
And
Yeah,
especially
not like that, but yes.
like after having had an agent before and having like this whole new list of requirements that I needed from a new agent, you know, I was lucky enough to be able to interview 3 different agents because at this time around, I got 3 offers to represent.
Dang, nice.
Um, so I was able to check off all these boxes, and like the only box that I didn't check off with Anne was that you know, that she had already had book deals for graphic novels, you know. But everything else about her was exactly what I needed. She checked all of the other boxes other than having graphic novel deals that she'd come out with. You know, she was editorial, which I needed because my last agent was not editorial. And I felt like we weren't even getting nibbles because there was something about my submissions that weren't quite checking all of these boxes for the editors, you know. So I needed someone that had a good, you know, finger on the pulse of the industry that I felt like maybe my other agent wasn't giving me. And then, you know, so between that, the fact that she had a lot of resources at her disposal with the agency that she was with over, you know, at least one of the other agencies that I was interviewing. But the thing that really sold me was talking to her clients. So, and just talking to them about all of the things that she had been doing for them and how, you know, aggressive she was about negotiating contracts and getting book deals. So I was like, oh, well, I'd be stupid not to go with her. So like actually at our next conference, I'm on the faculty, she's actually on the faculty, and we're going to be doing an in conversation about how, you know, an agent can become your dream agent when you didn't realize they were out there. And she's definitely my dream agent.
Oh, okay, interesting. So she liked the Peter Cadaver based story, but then you guys ended up selling The Many Misfortunes instead. Is that right? Did you go out with Peter Cadaver?
Yeah, because I think
and then it just
between,
didn't, you pulled
between
it
the
or
time No, we never so with my old agent we went out with the Peter Cadaver story, and it wasn't Peter Cadaver, it was his sister that was the main character in the graphic novel that we went out on sub with. But as soon as I signed with Anne, I was like, I'd already been kind of doing a lot of my own legwork trying to set up full manuscript requests with editors. So I had been going to Well, at that time it was during the pandemic, so I was going to all these virtual conferences and signing up for manuscript critiques where my main goal was to get a full manuscript request or like a pitch
Totally.
packet request from these editors. So by the time I signed with Anne, I had an editor at Scholastic and at Chronicle that wanted to see full manuscript,
Wow.
and then one that also during the Pit Mad liked it from Holiday House as well. So
Nice.
um, and there was another one at Pixel and Ink that had been liking all of my Peter Cadaver comic strips and sharing them on social media. So I knew I probably had a good
Oh,
in with that publisher as well.
oh, wait, you had a ton of interest in this manuscript, and but it did not get sold.
Well, so like with Scholastic, they wouldn't look at it until I had an agent. And so I had like as soon as I got signed by an agent, I was going to send that back to her. At least once Anne helped me get it into what we felt like was submission ready. And so I was like, let's prioritize this project first because I had all these editors that were interested in it. So that's why we went
Yeah.
out on sub with that. And fortunately for us, as soon as we went out on sub with it, Christy Choi, who is my editor at Athenaeum, was immediately interested. So I think we did 2 revise and resubmits for her, and then got a book deal from her. So that was nice, and that was like a very different experience than we had I had previously with being out on sub with the Salem project.
Is for Eugenia was part of the attraction, the immediate attraction, like a cultural representation connection thing? Because Eugenia Wang is it's very cultural American born Chinese from the get-go. Is there an importance there that you guys found in the negotiation?
Right. I think that kind of clinched the deal for sure. The funny thing is the story didn't start with any Chinese culture in it. But one of the things that I noticed as I was going on school visits for There's a Zombie in the Basement was somewhere during that process, I started reading a lot of books by Chinese American authors like Andrea Wang and Grace Lin, Kelly Yang. And I started to think, well, why was it that I made my main character in There's a Zombie in the Basement white?
Interesting. Yeah.
It made me kind of
Sounds like it wasn't a
question
conscious
why that
choice.
happened.
Yeah, yeah.
And it wasn't, it was reflexive. I never considered making that character anything but white. And so
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
started asking myself why. And I started thinking about, like, growing up, what the children's books I was reading were and where the Chinese representation was. And the only book that I can think of that was in my school library that had Chinese representation was The Five Chinese Brothers, which didn't really make me feel that good about being Chinese. And so
Right. Yeah.
I was like, you know what? I really need to redraw There's a Zombie in the Basement so that my main character is Chinese. And in the process, I made my main character in what ended up becoming The Many Misfortunes of Eugenia Wang Chinese as well, which was great because then I could bring in
Interesting.
like some of the Chinese superstitions and things. And one of the things that also happened as I was getting manuscript requests for this, or manuscript critiques for this project, was one of the editors encouraged me to simplify the story. And so my main character was having visions of their impending death on their 13th birthday that they start to believe is a premonition. And at that time, the portal into these visions was smells. So the story was called Olfactory Memory. Um, and
Interesting.
so as I was simplifying the story, I'm like, well, since we took the olfactory thing away, how is she going to be getting into these visions? I'm like, well, why don't I make her a comic, a comic artist, and the comics not only a way of her documenting this weird dream she's been having, but also become a portal, and things start to happen in the story because when I was writing Olfactory Memory, it was clear that the story wasn't scary to me anymore. But I liked the story. But as I made her a comic artist and things are happening, like she doesn't remember changing her comic or drawing things and there's automatic drawing going on, it became spooky to me again. So it became my bucket list item once again in the process of revision. So in addition to incorporating the Chinese culture into it, it also became scary to me again. And so it was checking off all these boxes, and it made me feel a lot better that that was the story that sold and not olfactory memory.
It's interesting because it feels so natural just through the process of revision and iteration on the story. It feels so natural that that's incorporated into the
Yeah.
story. I mean, the first page,
And you know,
you
that's the
draw
whole thing
these
about
parallels.
killing your darlings. You know, I think that a lot of people get precious about things and don't want to change it. But there's a reason that these professional editors do what they do, because they have a lot of insights, have kind of their fingers on the pulse of the market and what they want to sell. And more times than not, their suggestions are what, I mean, it's really a team project. And the end result is definitely better than where I started, you know. This is like 6 iterations of major revisions on a fairly large project.
Yeah, yeah. And you said it was during the pandemic, and that was that about the time the manuscript sold and you started working with your new agent?
Yeah, I think like the pandemic lockdown had a lot of come to Jesus moments for me, because that was when I kind of known for about a year that things weren't working with my agent. And so I finally pulled the trigger at that point. But I actually spent another year like really kind of fine tuning this manuscript, and going to these virtual conferences and making these connections, because I really wanted to have something that I felt really solid about before entering the query trenches again.
Yeah.
So, um, so that's kind of how this all happened. I think like by the time I signed with Anne, a lot of the pandemic lockdowns were already over by then. But
Okay.
as you well know, everything in publishing takes a long time.
Yeah. Well, because that's what I was gonna ask. If it sold like 2020, 2021, and now it's finally coming out, that's a long
Yeah.
stretch. Like, was it pushed back at all, or was that always the publication date? No. Okay.
No, that was always the publication date. I think we got a verbal, like I first got interest at the beginning of 2022 from Athenaeum, and then by the time I did the two revise and resubmits, I got a verbal, like right around Letters and Lines conference in September, and
Okay.
then we actually inked the real contract before the end of 2022. And of
Okay.
course, as you probably already know, you actually start working on things before you actually sign contracts in this industry. The verbal is essentially firm enough, and you know that, you're gonna sign the real thing.
Right, right.
So get to work is what you're saying.
Yes.
So one thing I wanted to just draw a parallel to is this, we didn't explicitly say earlier in the conversation, but is this the book that took a year, 264 pages,
Yeah.
start to finish, all the different
Yes.
steps? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it actually started at 280 pages, and then after I sent in my manuscript, like the final roughs, all lettered and everything. Um, then they had like an editorial meeting where they're like, oh yeah, we're going to limit middle grade books to 200 pages, and my editor's like, I think we can do it. And I'm
Ooh,
like, no, we can't pull 80 pages out of this and still
that's a
make it
third of
work.
the book. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
granted, we did, kill some darlings, but it was only 30 pages worth of darlings. And in the end, we ended up adding pages because the page count didn't equal the signatures. And so that's how it ended up being 264 pages anyway. So they didn't save a whole lot of money on that. But I think, the things that have been happening so far show that, I think there's a good chance that this book is going to make a splash. It has already been announced as being a 2025 Junior Library Guild selection, and
Awesome.
I'm one of 6 authors that Simon and Schuster is sending out to the ALA conference this summer.
Wow. Very cool.
And I was one of the authors that was showcased, or this was one of the books that was showcased in the fall preview live cast. So I got to go right before Peter Brown, of Wild Robot fame. So
Wow. At least you didn't have to go after.
yeah, exactly. it's been pretty humbling for me as my traditional debut,
Yeah,
to have
wow.
all of this stuff happening
Congratulations.
right out of the gate. But then again, like everyone keeps telling me, but you've this has been decades of everything, a
Yeah.
confluence of all of those things. So from one standpoint, yeah, but this is also something that as debut authors, not everyone should expect this.
Yeah, right, right. Temper expectations a little.
Yeah,
But
but you
I'm
taught, yeah,
also
that's the
proof
point,
that
right?
this
Like
can happen.
yeah.
Right,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, that's the actionable wisdom, right? It's like it can
Yeah,
happen. You are tipping the scales of winning this sort of debut
right,
attention on your debut
right.
lottery
I
with
mean,
all of this
and it
massive amount of experience.
and if you think about, okay, well, really, I started making concerted steps towards this when I joined SCBWI. It's been 9 years,
Yeah, right.
so I'm a 9 year overnight success.
Oh, amazing. Okay, so what I wanted to pivot to was I wanted to talk just a little bit about the Cuttlefish Academy before we let you
Oh
go.
yeah,
Tell us just about your role and, what it's like and yeah.
yeah. So like all of the co-founders and some of the people that we brought on, I'm probably like the least accomplished of the professors, but I had been teaching. And I've helped to develop a degree program in sequential storytelling at like the Community College of Aurora, and
Cool.
I've been teaching at the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. And prior to that, I'd been teaching comic art summer camps since like right around 2007. So I have a lot of teaching experience, and my focus, especially with the Cuttlefish Academy, is in the graphic novel area. Now, we created the school just because most of us have experience teaching higher education and just seeing like how little money we're making as adjunct faculty and how much the students are paying for. I mean, and granted, a lot of the education they're getting is foundational. And so that's not what we wanted to do. We didn't want to recreate, this is how you do perspective, this is how you do anatomy. I mean, there's like a bunch of free YouTube videos and things where you can learn all of these things. What we wanted to do was to do some things that we didn't see that these art schools were giving people, which was to level up their work so that they could get agented or so that they could get the book deal that was eluding them. And since, the professors like Kaz and, Heather Brockman Lee, Lily Williams, Jessica Lannon, they're all like award winning author illustrators. So they've got a lot of wisdom and can tell people how they did what they did, but we also are really diverse from one another. So for me, like where I fit in is I'm the graphic novel specialist, and so a lot of the classes that we're teaching aren't foundational, but they're meant to help people get their portfolios or get their dummy manuscripts to the point where they have something that is saleable in a very competitive environment. I think I'm kind of unique among the professors in that a lot of what I'm teaching is a little bit more foundational, just because there are a lot of people that are curious about graphic novels but don't know where to start because it's such an expansive medium. And so I've kind of taken a lot of how I used to teach kids' summer camps where I incorporate gameplay into things. And I also take what I've done with the 24-hour comic book challenge, where in order to remove a lot of the preciousness away from, like, I'm going to work on my epic project during this 24-hour comic book day challenge, I like do some randomizations to like have all of my students start with a project from scratch. Because every time I've taught on a college level, every time I let one of my students talk me into letting them work on a project that they've already started, there are learning objectives that they miss. And so if I can make them start with a fresh project, I can force them into doing different processes that they might not have done before. And then
Because they're
they
not
can
feeling so
learn.
precious about
Yeah,
the
yeah.
project. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so they're just going through the process of working on this kind of impulsive project. And then so they'll, all right, I'll go through this and see how it is. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm glad I did this because I hadn't been doing this as a part of my process. And that's really what a lot of my classes are about, is about process. Because again,
Yeah.
you got to meet deadlines. And so
Yeah,
unless you
right.
really lock down on your process, and on top of that, it makes you really think about whether you want to do this. Because I would say if you want to increase your per hour pay, because none of our contracts are hourly contracts, you got to work faster and you'll automatically give yourself a
Yeah, right.
raise. But it also kind of makes you think about, is
Smart.
this really for me? Can I be passionate about this? Is this like really the level of storytelling that I'm interested in doing? You know, because it's not something that you really want to get into kind of, like Mr. Miyagi says, karate yes, okay, karate no, okay, karate maybe, you get squished like a grape.